The Blue Blood, a story by Slime Special 681, Chapter 7C. The United States. As the final moments of the princess's deadline ticked away, all across the world an untold number of strangers, neighbors, and families huddled together in emergency shelters. Some cried, others tried to crack jokes, most prayed. With the civilian population concentrated around disaster relief zones, not only could the various governments more effectively care for their immediate needs, but it was reasoned that the enemy would have no need to target civilians that were out of their way. With this in mind, the various militaries of the world tried to evacuate as many as possible. Some brave souls still out there searching, even as the last moments drew near. Staff Sergeant Melissa Gordon was one such soul, and whether by cruelty or mercy, Melissa survived the initial bombardment. On her way back, with the last truckload of refugees, the rest of her squad either back at base caring for the rest of the refugees, or just entering the trucks in front of her. An unseen beam connected with the base. And just like that, it and everyone in it was gone. Consumed in invisible flames and a growing lake of molten glass. Her group alone would be spared. She survived to see the tragedy that claimed Colonel Opal and her brothers in arms. She survived to see the tragedy that claimed her friends, her neighbors, her countrymen. She survived the tragedy that stripped away the love of her life as he held their two crying sons. She survived all of this by a city block. She stopped the transport. She clearly saw the ever-present backglow of the molten lake in the night. Tears streaming from her eyes, she clenched her hands around the steering wheel tight enough to split her knuckles, and she let out a guttural scream. She screamed and screamed until all the air left her lungs. Then she threw up all over the dashboard and passed out. The operation on the North American continent was unique amongst the various operations composing the nuclear nullification campaign. For starters, the Stygian 1st Battalion was the only strike force in the campaign outside of the Glaives not to have their plans be drawn up by the second princess, as they had thrown out the plans she drew up for them. Under the princess's original plan, they were to land in force at the half-glassed airbase, make a beeline for the local chief, and basically hope they didn't get their teeth stomped by the angry natives in the process. Lieutenant Colonel Tian Uanui Vunu Kuan, or as the Ricari called her, Tianu, instead opted to coordinate her strike with the various companies of the Ricari 1st Paratroop Division. Over the 2-day journey, Lieutenant Colonel Tianu and Major General Clement hashed things out. In a surprising show of humility, Tianu had given the honor of the first strike to Major General Clement and the woman of the Ricari 1st. The Ricari 1st Paratroop Division would take the deactivated and largely forested enemy base known as Fort Fouté as their main FOB. From there, the plan was as follows. 23 companies, each 175 women strong, 25 pods apiece, would capture and secure LZs, while 5 companies would secure secondary targets. 41 companies would secure a siege line around the capital. They would land along strategic points along the length of a local road known as Capital Beltway 495, with one specifically dedicated to holding the Woodrow Wilson Memorial Bridge and maintain a line of observation on National Harbor. After establishing a perimeter, they would activate several Hellcat scramblers in the hopes of cutting off or at the least severely gambling any wireless communication to or from the capital. 40 companies would secure local power production facilities and shut them down. This would hopefully further limit the communication abilities of the capital. After the establishment of a safe LC, the Stygian 1st Battalion would land and establish a FOB at the Boiling AFB. From there they would advance to and take their given objectives. Empress willing, they would find the local chieftain and obtain a surrender somewhere during that process. So it was that after 20 minutes of the initial bombardment, the shuttles of the Stygian 1st Battalion landed at the LC in Boiling. The doors of the shuttle bearing the 1st Stygian Battalion silently slid open to reveal Lieutenant Colonel Tianu and her troops. Captain Timir and the members of the 72nd Rakari Paratroop Company, not currently securing the perimeter, greeted them with a salute. Lieutenant Colonel Tianu returned the gesture before having her troops disembark. The constraints of the wider invasion forced her to delay the landing of the battalion's armor. And, in all likelihood, they'd be stuck with the same 3 small, 6-woman APCs that had been deployed with the 72nd. "Anything to report, Captain?" Tianu asked the jet-black Rakari male. "The base is ours, ma'am, and the neighboring military base no longer possesses any survivors." He puffed out his chest a bit to reveal several small tab necklaces that he'd taken from his close-quarter kills. "Unfortunately, we are receiving reports of around 60 incoming enemy aircraft." "Very well. Commander Sergeant Major Dukta." Vurcha Dukta, a small woman of 6'7", stepped forward. "Get on the comms with the fleet. Tell them we require immediate fighter air support." "Yes, ma'am," she responded, immediately reaching to her back where her long-ranged fleet comms device sat. This turn of events was of little concern, however, as after countless consortium raids and near-endless drills, the Stygian 1st Battalion was by far the most elite battalion outside of the Golden Glaives participating in this invasion. In addition to this, Martianus Attia Disari was an open supporter of the heart of Stygios and his policies. So when he voiced his concerns about the current state of readiness in the Marines a year ago, during a planning session for a proposed invasion of the Delcora system, the Martianess took action. She had privately sought out the Empress immediately after the meeting and received her permission to equip the Stygian 1st Corps with a prototype Restar anti-air and anti-vehicle rocket launcher as a proof of concept. As such, they didn't share the same dependence on armor as the majority of the Imperium ground forces. In the aftermath of the initial bombardment, there were numerous widespread communication blackouts, especially on the coast, but they were not total. Washington, D.C. in particular had miles of hard cable communication lines pouring into the surrounding country and a port. The former enabled them to avoid most of the initial jamming attempts. The latter enabled wider communication by means of emergency-drafted civilian vessels and the Atlantic Fleet. This high-stakes game of naval telephone was only possible thanks to Admiral Christopher Watson Grady, who, as acting commander of the United States Fleet Forces Command, deployed the fleet from Norfolk prior to the initial orbital bombardment. As such, the Atlantic Fleet remained largely intact, save for the carriers, whose iconic size and flat deck made them easier to spot and thus track from space. Unfortunately, his decision was not able to save Norfolk, nor the families of the fleet that resided within its borders. When the first beam had hit, Drew Fleming and Freddie Grayson had been in the base's freezer sharing a joint. As Freddie passed the joint to Drew, a series of unseen beams rapidly struck the buildings comprising Robbins Air Force Base. One landed near the mess, and the heat from the strike cooked Drew from the inside and caused a sudden formation of bone-deep blisters on Freddie's left arm. After that, somewhere in between the shock and adrenaline, Freddie had somehow managed to make his way outside. Within a few moments, the scope of the new reality set in on the remainder of the base. The strike was wide, and while it did destroy most of the base, its fighters and its personnel, it failed to take out the runway. In fact, it didn't even touch it, almost as though the enemy intended to make future use of it themselves. Regardless of the scope of the destruction, 12 F-15s and 8 of their pilots remained operational. After being shot up with what remained of the base's painkillers, that number grew to 12 operational pilots, of which Freddy was one. His air squadron had been deployed 15 minutes later. Their objective was to defend the capital, as it was apparently the main focus of the enemy's attack. Freddy Grayson felt the bandaging on his left arm grow sore and damp, the painkillers only being so effective as he held his course. This is Stewart. Command reports warning red in DC. This is Grayson. B1, I'm reading 2 bandits on intercept due southeast. Weapons free. Aside from 4 other F-15s from other AFBs, they would be the only ones to make it to the airspace above the capital. The George Bush Center of Intelligence, Virginia, CIA headquarters. Whatever these things are, they're huge and quick. They just... Agents Strong and Floyd Well are KIA in the East Corridor. Agents... Grenade! Oh God! Aim for the joints. It slows them down. We're not penetrating. We need something... We're falling back to the armory. Director, what's your orders? Director? Oh, God. Captain Fermat of the 114th Rakari Paratroop Company looked at the defeated tribal interior pack leader. This Gina Haspel was not the fight she'd been promised. Sure, she tried, even managed to stab her in her armpit with a small knife of some kind, but she was a Clay Grinshaw. One solid kick and there she laid, back broken against her deck and choking on her own blood. It was a terribly disappointing outcome to an agonizingly short fight. Honestly speaking, were it not for her implied value as an enemy pack leader, she would not be worth taking a trophy from. However, she had drawn first blood despite her apparent frailty, and that was no small thing in the eyes of the ancestors. As it stood, the knife that had pierced her had an inherent value to the young Rakari, as all weapons that draw first blood in a duel ought to. It was a value that was greatly increased when Fermat used it to take the enemy pack leader's life. Lieutenant Colonel Tianu watched as her girls began to advance into the city proper, a sense of pride and purpose burning in all their chests. They marched today to prove the validity of the words of the heart of Stygios, and perhaps even earn his praise. Just then, a battalion-wide communication alert came across the fleet's emergency message channel. Streaming across every Marine's HUD was a single red sentence. Second Prince Dura of House Durtarna has died in combat.